In my opinion, inspection and test plans are fundamental to the delivery of technical compliance and excellence on our projects. This is irrespective of project size, business unit or sector. As an industry, not just as a business, but as an industry, we're not good at creating and using inspection and test plans effectively. For me, the inspection and test plan should be the Bible for the delivery of a package of work. It defines the essential activities, when they should be completed and inspected, and very importantly, how we verify that those activities are complete. We all know that specifications are becoming increasingly generic, non-user friendly and hard to read. The inspection and test plan provides a perfect way to distill the key elements of the specification into a single, easy to use document. And finally, once the ITP is created, the final key stage is to keep it as a live document. An inspection and test plan produced, approved and filed in your bottom drawer is of limited use, whereas an ITP produced, approved, briefed to the team and reviewed as a regular item at your progress meetings is an effective use of the document. So, what is an inspection and test plan? To put it simply, it defines the critical or must-do activities required in a trade to ensure specification compliance. What it's not is a check sheet, and that's equally important for us to realise. For example, when considering a trade such as in situ concrete, it's important that we ensure that reinforcement position and quality is checked, cover, builder's work openings, cast-in items, cleanliness of the deck. All of those items are checked, but we don't need to list them individually on the inspection and test plan. There's a check sheet already in place for that. The ITP requirement should simply be use pre-port inspection checklist. That way you keep the document simple and usable. Reviewing the specification. I'm now going to review the F10 specification for brick and block walling and highlight the items that I would expect to be in the inspection and test plan for this works. On page 1, clause 110 identifies the brick type for the contemporary facade. This requires a material approval. Clause 115 also identifies the bricks that supplement the reclaimed bricks, so this is yet another material approval. And furthermore, we've got clause 120 identifies the brick for the party wall, as does clause 125. Clause 130 identifies the type of glazed brick for the party wall light well, and therefore that is yet another material approval. Clause 230 identifies the specification for the reclaimed facing bricks, and 315 for just clay common bricks. And lastly, we've got clause 355 that identifies the type of common blockwork required. So all of these clauses have identified a specific material and should be added to your ITP for individual approval. I wouldn't personally group them together as one, because material approvals information will be submitted at different times. By managing them individually, you can track them individually and sign them off at different stages. All of these material approvals would be a hold point for the trade contractor. We cannot progress, cannot order the bricks until they have been approved. But ultimately, the approval in this case for those materials would be by the architect or possibly the client. Moving on, clause 365 is a fairly unique material, but it's an insulated starter course. But that is a unique material and therefore also needs approval. The manufacturer and product reference are referenced, but we should still get the material certification from the client and submit it to the approving body to prove compliance with this specification. As we move on through the specification now, we move away from material approvals and into some more fundamental parts of delivery. You'll see clause 410 talks about compressive strength of the mortar for each wall type, and we should therefore be testing the mortar as required, as can be seen in bold type. That does unfortunately cross-reference a different specification, so this shows slight complication where you may need to bring two specifications into one inspection and test plan. But ultimately, the ITP reference is to undertake mortar testing. We then get into the delivery of the works, and you'll see at the bottom of the page, clause 500 talks about the laying of bricks generally. Further requirements for the laying of bricks are also referenced in clause 520, 535 and 690. And I would group those all into one line, which is installation of brickwork or construction of brick panels. And the check is to use our brickwork check sheet. The verifying document, therefore, is completed brickwork check sheets. That would be 100% completion by our trade contractors. And depending on how your project is set up, maybe 100% countersigning by the project manager or package manager, maybe a random 10 or 20% inspection. That would be unique to your project, the type of work you're doing and the criticality to it. If you move on through the specification, we find a few more detailed requirements. For example, clause 690 talks about the minimum and maximum temperatures for laying bricks and mortar. So we should include that in the inspection and test plan. We need to maintain weather records so that we can prove we installed brickwork in the correct ambient conditions. So maintaining weather records is important so that we can prove that we laid the bricks in the correct conditions, and also the archiving of those records. Those verification documents, remember the last column said, where are we going to keep them? Are they kept on Conject? Are they automatically downloaded to a spreadsheet? Wherever they are, we need to keep them. So if there is ever a query on how the brickwork were laid, we've got material approvals to prove it was the correct brick. We've got our checklist to prove we installed it and inspected it correctly. And we've got our weather records to prove that we laid it in the correct environmental conditions. And that we can reference all those at the end of the trade, some 12 months later, 24 months later, whatever it would be. Moving on through the specification, we find clause 730. That references the construction and approval of a sample panel. So this is what I would call out of sequence. This is an activity that must be a hold point before we actually start construction. So whilst it's clause 730 in the specification, that's not the order to list it in the inspection and test plan. That would be an earlier item. Material approval first, then your sample approval, then you start construction. We move on to clause 740, which is a reference panel. The difference between a sample panel and a reference panel is quite clear. The sample panel is a unique, standalone element of work that will be redundant. It is not required, it is not built into the permanent works, it's usually built near the offices somewhere or even off-site. The reference panel is usually the first panel of brick or block work in the permanent works, and that is checked with reference back to the sample panel. So we have a material approval, we then have a sample panel approval to prove that it all looks okay and everyone is happy before we commence. And then we commence the works, and our first panel is our reference panel. Have we met the sample? And then lastly, I've got clause 750, which references colour consistency. And again, this is about between the sample and the reference panel, and that gives us reference to what the colour consistency is, what the expectations are, and what the architect is expecting to see. Interestingly, in this specification, there are a number of items that are not referenced that I would consider should be in the inspection and test plan. And as a package manager, you should be thinking about what else is required. There are a number of material approvals that are not listed. For example, the DPC, the brick ties, the lintels, insulation type, wind posts, cavity barriers and fire stops, and bed joint reinforcement if required. All of those are materials. All of those need to comply with a specification, and if not referenced in your project spec, will need to comply with a British Standard, Eurocode and the like. So we should be obtaining the details of the exact materials we propose to use and submitting them to our client, our design team, for their approval. They are all an integral part of that activity, an integral part of the finished brickwork, and therefore should be approved. The last item I would expect to see on there is the completion of health and safety file information, the collation of everything that proves completion and compliance of that trade with the specification. That's the last item for completing a trade. That's the last item, therefore, on the inspection and test plan.